Great. Okay. Welcome everybody to a very special edition. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are zooming in from. We are very excited to end this year's seminar series with a very special and our first paleo panel discussion on navigating grad school. And we have an amazing list of panelists who are previous speakers at different stages of their research careers or their careers in general. So we are very excited to have them lead a discussion on the trials and tribulations of grad school and ending it with a moderated question and answers that for the major part were asked by the wider paleo community. So thank you everybody also for sending in your questions that will be answered towards the end. Before we get started, a little bit about the format of today's events, welcome and announcements, spend 5 minutes on that. We'll have the panelists introduce themselves and followed by a panel discussion based on different topics. And then we will end with a moderated question and answer session. During this time, during the talk and during the discussion, if you do have more questions, feel free to send them at questions at eoPanels, who today is Rema, and then we will also have a tea time, an informal chat with the panelists for about 30 minutes. And then again, yeah, don't forget to send your questions via chat to the questions paleo panel host, who today is Rema. A little bit of housekeeping. We value the participation of all folks interested in paleo sciences. If you find yourself here without going through our code of conduct, please make sure that you go through our code of conduct. You can find the link on our website and on our Twitter and Instagram pages. Please mute yourself for the duration of the talk. This is for better audio when we upload the talk to YouTube. You can also ask questions by chatting to the questions at paleo panel host or by raising your hand. And if you do that, we will unmute you and then you can ask your question yourself. We now also have closed captions built into Zoom. You could use that by pressing the CC button to show or hide them. And then as always, nominate an outstanding early career research scientist over here. The link should be in the Zoom chat shortly. And we will also put in another link soliciting weekly feedback form for demographic info. And some exciting news, we have more funding successes from last week. We are very grateful and thankful to the Cushman Society, the Geochemical Society, and the Paleontological Society for funding the talks that we do and making our talks more accessible. With that, I will let the panelists introduce themselves with their institution, name, career stage, the topic that they're working on, and the list of the panelists are on the screen. So with that, I think, Tripti, you can get started.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks for organizing this panel. So my name's Tripti Bhattacharya. I'm an assistant professor at Syracuse University. I got my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where I worked on topics related to drought in Central America and hydroclimate. And now I work on broader questions of how monsoons and subtropical hydroclimate have changed over different timescales.
Oh, Flavia, you are muted.
Hello, everyone. I am Flavia Boscolo-Galazzo. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Bergen University, working on plant isotope paleoceanography on foraminifera. I did my PhD at Padova University in Italy. This was a collaboration with Yale University, so I spent some of my PhD there as well. And I was working on benthic foraminiferal turnover during global warming events in the Eocene. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we are still waiting for Jorge to join us. And while we do that, maybe Advait, do you want to?
Yeah, yep, I can go ahead. Thank you so much. My name is Advait Jukar. I'm a Donnelly postdoctoral associate at Yale and a vertebrate paleontologist. I got my PhD at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, where I studied patterns of temporal faunal change in South Asian mammal assemblages and the megafaunal extinction. And this is kind of the work that I've been doing for the last 4 years or so, but I also sometimes dabble in dinosaur paleoecology. Thank you. Pedro, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. And if you're on the west coast of the U.S., good morning, but good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Yeah, my name is Pedro Monarrez. I'm a Stanford Earth postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. My work here at Stanford focuses on the evolution of marine animal body size, and in particular, using that as a predictor for extinction and origination across the Phanerozoic, but I'm also using physiological modeling to apply physiology and metabolic theory to the fossil record. I got my PhD from the University of Georgia, and my topic for that was assessing the role of biotic interactions in driving diversity patterns during the Jurassic within a stratigraphic framework.
Thank you. One of our other panel members, Omar, is running late on a bus, but we are very thankful that he will be joining us. So he'll be joining us later on. And I think with that, Gabi, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabi Serrato-Marks. I'm coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. I got my PhD in 2020 in the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute joint program. Tripti was actually one of my PhD thesis committee members. It's really great to be here. I've now transitioned into more of an education and outreach role. So I work at the Broad Institute, which is a biomedical research institution running a post-bac program. So doing a little bit more of that education aspect now.
Okay, great. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. I saw that Omar just joined us. So if you want to do it right now, we'd be very happy if you introduced yourself.
Yeah, sure, I can do. Okay, so my name is Omar Rafael Regalado Fernández. I'm currently doing a postdoc as a guest researcher at the University of Tübingen here in Germany. I work on dinosaur evolution, and well, currently my postdoc focuses on taxonomy and phylogenetics, but the goal is to do some biomechanics later on in my postdoc. And thank you everyone for the patience.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for joining and being able to be the panelists. I will stop sharing the screen and just, showcase that we have a wide variety of expertise and wide people calling from all over the world as well. So very excited to have this discussion. I think we will get things kickstarted by me asking a general question to Gabi, Pedro, Flavia. What was your PhD experience like, and what tip would you give to a new graduate student? If either one of you want to take that question and run with it, and then we can have a broader discussion within the panelists as well. Oh, so I can ask Advait. Do you want to kick things off?
I don't know if he heard.
Oh yeah, okay. I guess Gabi, since you unmuted.
I can start, sure, yeah. So my PhD experience was focused on stalagmites, and it was my first time ever going into a cave when I started. I actually went into a cave like 3 months before I actually started at MIT. So it was really different from what I had done as an undergrad, which was all deep sea coral. And I really enjoyed getting to go on fieldwork trips and just like the variety of different work that I did, because I did lab work, fieldwork, computer stuff, taught myself how to code in Python, like all of that. So I think that was one of the most enjoyable parts of my PhD that I wasn't really expecting when I started. And my advice, or what I wish I had known, is to just take really, really careful notes and logs about what you do, just like what you would do in the lab. But like, why did you make this figure? What are you showing? Where did you put your data? Sort of that type of thing that I was going back 3 or 4 years later and remaking figures, and then realized later I had already made them, that type of thing. So taking really careful note of what you've done and what you still need to do would be one of my biggest factors.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And then Pedro, would you like to add something? And as well, since Gabi mentioned she works in caves and stalagmites. Do you guys spend a lot of time in museums, and how does that, do you have tips geared towards that for incoming PhD students?
Want to go ahead or?
Go ahead, Pedro. I'll go after you.
Sure. My experience in museums was actually very limited, and most of it was to assess holotype material that we use to create a field guide to have with us in the field when we did field work. My dissertation work was heavily based on field work, and so, but I did end up working a little bit at the Smithsonian Institute and at the Natural History Museum in London. And in part, again, it's just to learn the taxonomy, and that's a good way to do it without having to rely solely on publications. And so I fortunately had the funding to be able to travel and to these institutions and work on them. And so I would highly recommend anyone who works on fossil material to be able to take a trip to a museum institution to look at firsthand and actually hold it in your hand, as opposed to looking at photos from old publications to help you in your studies.
So I actually spent pretty much all of my time in grad school in museums. George Mason was an interesting place to do a PhD because my degree is not in paleontology or geology or biology. It's in environmental science and policy, because that was the only degree granting department at Mason. But because Mason is in DC, I could be affiliated with the Smithsonian, so I spent most of my time there. I think what was most helpful for me was to be a part of a separate community of scholars in a different institution, which gave me a different perspective on the kind of work that I was doing, and I picked up new skills there. Coming back to museums, most of my dissertation involved going to the NHM in London or going to museums in India and sampling specimens there. I got a lot of smaller grants. Being an international student, I could not apply for a lot of the big NSF grants, so that's sort of what I depended on. I think the most important thing for me in grad school was to find other mentors who I could depend on for different parts of my PhD.
Yeah, those are really good topics that we'll definitely touch on in terms of finding funding and mentors outside your direct PI. And then I think just staying a little bit on this topic a bit more, Omar, would you like to add anything on tips for graduate students? And I think something that I can also add in is normalizing mental health and how important that was for Omar, you, and then Gabi and Advait and Pedro, if you want to talk a little bit about that. And then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things I was gonna chime in with was that there is a stigma on mental health. I mean, for every aspect of our lives, but particularly in grad school, where talking to a psychologist or things like that are considered a waste of time or something that will drag your career, because you're spending time on, going to psychologists using mental health services. So something I will really recommend is to make sure the university, or to check on what are the mental health services that your university provides. So what we have to remember is that life happens, and sometimes it has nothing to do with the grad program you're in. When I was a PhD student, I mean, the PhD was the only thing going according to plan. The rest of my life was not. And it was very good to know that UCL, the university I was in, had a very robust infrastructure on mental health services that I only got to know when I needed them, which was good. Like in part, the fact that you know that they're there when you need them, that's good. But it's good if you start the PhD knowing that, this is your safety net, this is somewhere you can ask for help, and these are the things you can do. Hopefully you won't need them, but chances are you will, based on statistics published by Elsevier and most of the important journals. Chances are 1 in 3 PhD students will require mental health services, like robust mental health services. So that's something to start looking for before even starting a PhD, I would say.
Yeah, I'm gonna follow that up and just second what Omar said. From my own personal experience, I actually almost quit my PhD program because of mental health issues within my first year. And at the time, I was very unaware of the resources available until I actually found them, and that's what ultimately saved my PhD. And so after the first year, everything went really well, and but I credit a lot of that to finding the help on campus, and it just so happens that the University of Georgia has a really strong counseling and psychiatric services. And so once I got a handle on how to manage it on my own, everything went well. And so if you know that you might have the propensity for mental health issues, or if you are just aware of it, and maybe even if you've never experienced it, and you just want to see what's available there, as Omar said, there's a good chance that you might at some point during your grad school career experience a mental health hardship. And so definitely take a look at it as you're considering which schools you want to go to for grad school.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Omar and Pedro, for sharing that. And as we transition on to a bit, because we are time constrained, on to the next topic about being a graduate student and picking conferences, I would like to spend some time on that, and then maybe start with Flavia, if you have some thoughts on essentially the conversation that we just had on general tips to graduate students, and also how should graduate students go about picking conferences that they'd like to attend, and what consideration should they keep in mind with these decisions? Because there are so many conferences and summer schools, so any thoughts and suggestions that you have?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, going to conferences and summer school is definitely part of our work and our work as PhD students. So that's no doubt about it. In terms of yeah, I mean, how frequently you should go. I would really say I mean, it depends on how many relevant conferences and how many relevant summer school you think that there may be in your field. So definitely try to attend at least all those that are really important for your education. This is something that links me back to the topics that we just deal with. I wanted to say something about, a PhD can definitely feel overwhelming and lead to these issues, mental issues as well. But I will also say that doing a PhD is a great opportunity, and there should be a way. I mean, going back, what I would do as a PhD, when I was a PhD student, would be try to enjoy it more. Not that I didn't, but I mean, looking back, I should have tried to have more fun. I mean, I had fun, but even more. And so doing a PhD is a great opportunity, and you should try to enjoy it as much as you can, and get the most out of it in terms of also on a human side, on a personal side. And it's the same as with conferences and summer schools. They can be challenging. There can be a lot of pressure on them because you go, I don't know, maybe there can be first time experience that you find yourself in an international environment. So you may also experience language challenges, but not have this put you down. Take it as like a way to also like meet new people who may have your same troubles, feel the same challenges. So make the most out of it and try to have fun without feeling the pressure or necessarily achieving something. You are there for yourself primarily. That's the main thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, having shared experiences being our common experiences as a way of engaging with people if it becomes too intimidating.
Exactly.
And then on that note as well, Tripti, would you like to add any suggestions that you have, your experiences now also going from like graduate school to postdoc to faculty, and how your perspective has changed? And
On conferences and networking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the advice I like to give PhD students in particular is think about the career you ultimately want. You know, I always encourage people to go like find an example of someone who has a job they might want someday and think about the skills you need to get there. And that can help guide your choice of conference, right? So if you know you want to do a postdoc in a particular field, you might pick conferences related to that. If you really have a passion, you know, I remember talking about this with Gabi, like science communication, pick those workshops and conferences. And that way, you know, there's not a strict number. It's like what Flavia said. It's topic based, and you attend the conferences that move your career in the direction you want it to go. And it's sort of getting you to think about grad school as a means to get where you want to be career-wise, rather than like the crushing pressure of graduate school itself, right? And that's sort of, I personally found topic-related conferences more helpful as a graduate student. Things like the Graduate Climate Conference, my students have a great time there every year. You know, AMQA, American Quaternary Association, those were always better than like AGU, frankly, for me. But now, you know, I try to go to a couple a semester, maybe. But it's really about connecting with the people who will help you achieve your career goals. Think of it that way.
Yeah, that's thank you for putting that forward. That's a really good way of thinking of the long-term goals. And I would also like to open the same question about conferences and any tips and suggestions that there are other panelists who haven't had a chance to speak yet about this topic would like to speak about, and then we will transition to the next topic. So whether it being an international student, that also requires, I know from personal experience, these are requirements, so that's something else that I also have to think of. And if anyone has any other experiences, yeah.
Yeah, so being an international student makes everything more complicated when you're in the US. So for conferences in the US, it's fairly easy if you're a student here, because you can just sort of go. But when I had to go to SVP, which is the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference in Canada, I had to get a separate visa just to go to Canada. And therefore I had to plan for that and plan a budget for that specifically. So that's an additional consideration for you. I think when I go to conferences, I sort of have a similar approach to what Tripti was talking about, which is think about where your collaborators might be. Go to those conferences, see who you can network with and talk to. I think conferences are some of the best venues to make these connections, not only for your postdoc, but also for your future academic career.
Yeah, great. Yep, great insight. And similar to that, another important part of being a graduate student, and something that we touched on previously, was fieldwork and lab work. And so I wanted to open this discussion on the topic by posing a question: what are your tips for planning and undertaking fieldwork? And Pedro and Omar, if you want to get started on this topic.
Okay, I can start if Pedro is all right with that. Okay, well, regarding museum work, well, particularly if you are going to be working in a collection, something I really like, I got the chance in UCL to work as a professor, as a teacher, and then as a worker at the Grand Museum of Zoology. If you are going to be working in a museum as part of your career, make sure you know what curation is and try to take internships on curation techniques, preparation techniques, not necessarily because you will know how to do them, but it will help you a lot to know, right now I was planning on a postdoc proposal. And when I was with this curator mindset, I was always thinking like, okay, this is something I would say will take 1 month, but it will actually take 3 because of all of these things. So kind of being on the other side, on the museum, and knowing how a museum works helps a lot. Even or also in a lab, just knowing what is the admin associated with all of these things helps a lot. So taking an internship, museums are always looking for interns or for part-time people because they're all underfunded. So they're always looking for people. So yeah, try to get, even if it's a short thing, like a 1 month thing, it will help a lot to have this perspective of the other side behind the curtain.
Yeah, thank you for that. Pedro, would you like to add anything on that? And then I'll also pose the same question to Gabi.
Yeah, I'm gonna mention a little bit about fieldwork since a lot of my previous background is doing fieldwork. The thing that I would recommend is to start planning way early, and I mean months to more than a year ahead, and particularly because of a couple of big reasons. I would say 3 big reasons. One, access to location. Can you get there readily and safely? 2, who owns the land you're working on? Who oversees it? And whether or not and you need to look into whether or not you need permits to work there. And then 3, you need to actually figure out what you're gonna do while you're there, and if you're gonna collect samples, how are you gonna bring them back? And so because of that, it's a multifaceted planning that should definitely be not left to the month before you go out. And so as an example, if you say do most of your field work in the summer, say if you're in the northern hemisphere, if you go in between June and August, you should probably start planning this the previous fall. So definitely assume that the planning is going to take longer than you think. So that way you're not caught off guard, and you can pretty much prepare for anything. But and also if there's more senior grad students or postdocs in your lab, I would also talk to them about how to best navigate planning fieldwork. Definitely don't do it alone. Talk to your PI, talk to people who are more senior members of your lab or department.
Yeah, I'll second that, to just asking questions. Something as simple as like, where's the best place to go to the bathroom when you're at this field site? How do you go to the bathroom at this field site? Can be really important, and it can be something that only people with more experience can answer. So don't be afraid to ask any questions. Nothing's a silly question, especially when it comes to safety. I had a bunch of kids ask me recently, like, how do you deal with being scared in a cave or when you're doing field work? And my response was that, like, I always have a healthy amount of fear and like try not to go in with too much confidence. Same thing in the lab. Like I try to work slowly and carefully, because I feel like when you get rid of that fear component completely, that's when you can make careless mistakes. So definitely asking questions and working at whatever pace works for you, and communicating if you need to go slowly, or if you're confused about something. I think it's easy to pretend like fieldwork is like super, super safe and fun, when it can be really fun, but it can be scary, like no matter where you are. So it's important to be careful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Clear communication and being okay with being afraid I think those are things that are not very commonly discussed when you're doing fieldwork. So I think that's really nice that you're putting that to the front lens. And I would also like to open the same question to the other panelists about tips and suggestions for doing fieldwork and lab work for graduate students.
Can I add a couple of points there? So I recently, by that I mean in 2019, had planned for fieldwork in India for 2020. And of course, something happened globally and I couldn't go. But because a lot of my collaborators were US citizens, we had to get special visas for them just to go there and do fieldwork. And that takes more time. So always budget for all of these things, for permits, for visas. And if you're going to be doing fieldwork internationally, make sure you have local collaborators. It's very important that you work with the local community, that you work with scientists who are in country there. Since I've done most of my work in museums, I would also say that budget a lot of time when you're prepping to go to a museum. Don't just email a collections manager 2 weeks before you want to go and say that I want to come at this time, because more often than not, there are 5 other people who want to come at the same time. So, try and plan, 6 months ahead, contact the collections managers, give them a list of specimens that you may want to look at or a collection. And when you're there, respect their time. Go when they ask you to come. Take care of the collection. Don't manhandle things. And things break sometimes. The worst thing you can do is just put it back in the drawer and close the drawer. If something breaks, just tell them. More often than not, we have glues that we can use to fix fossils.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Flavia and Tripti, do you have any tips and suggestions? And then we will move on to the next topic about.
I was just about to add that probably I feel like in European academia, at least where I've experienced from, everything is much more constrained. So you just need to follow what your university or your department guidelines are in terms of going to field work, for instance. So that would be my recommendation if there is any European, or let's say UK, Italian, or Norwegian PhD students. I'm sure that your university, your department will have like a framework where you can refer to for your field work and talk to your supervisor to get to be addressed toward it, basically.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. And then, as always, if there are things that weren't really covered for specific topics, feel free to drop that in the discussion or in the chat for Zoom. Gabi just dropped some really good points about buying field gear and things like that. So if something is not, if you've not been able to put forward your suggestion, please drop that in the Zoom chat. But we'll move on to the next question or the next topic about writing. Which is a seminal part of all graduate students and academia or even non-academia. So I think I'll pose a question on what is the best way to get started with dissertation thesis writing, and when should this process start? And Gabi and Advait, would you like to take this on first and then?
I can start with the fear of the blank page for sure. I always start with an outline, even if I know or think I know what I want to say. I found that writing an outline helps me clarify it, and it gets me over that hump of the blank page. And I think that can kind of get lost, like, oh, I don't need to write an outline, like I already know what my results are, I'll just go for it. But I find that if you write it, it actually helps you organize your thoughts. And I try to actually keep the outline even as I've like filled it in, like I copy it and paste it somewhere else, so that if I get myself like swirling on something and I realize like, oh, I only need a couple sentences about this, I'll go to the next thing. The outline helps a lot with that. And I think realizing that it's going to take longer and it will not be as good as you want it to be, and that's okay, it's part of the process. And not holding on to the draft for so long so that you can make it like perfect, because it's never going to be perfect. That's the nature of what we do. It's the nature of research. So don't be afraid to pass that draft on to someone for feedback. Keep moving.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a totally a good point.
Yeah, no, those are all excellent points. I think what I would like to add is that don't wait till the last 3 months before you have to submit your PhD to write your dissertation. I did something like that and it was a terrible idea. But the way PhDs are structured in the US, at least in most places, is that now there are about something like 4 separate chapters that are bound by some common topic, which you then staple together, and that's your dissertation. So I would advise you to start writing pretty early. Keep copious notes, especially if you're working with code. Annotate your code. If you're doing stuff in the lab, make sure you've got a well-organized lab notebook, so that then when you're working on your methods in your dissertation, you aren't trying to remember what you did 3 months ago in that museum where you saw that one cool specimen. Trying to think. Yeah, I think that's all for now. If I think of something else, I might pop it in the chat.
Yeah, great. I'll ask the same question to Tripti on what's the best way to get started with dissertation writing, and then also follow that up with Omar and Flavia, your suggestions on that as well, coming from the European side and the UK side.
I'll acknowledge that it feels like it's been a while for me, but I always would say like divide and conquer. So think of each of your chapters as totally separate rather than this whole PhD thesis that's intimidating. Start by writing the low stakes parts. So even now when I write a manuscript, I start writing with the methods or the supplemental information first, and then move to the main text. So that stuff you can just get out there without having to think, a huge amount. And then it feels easier to write the main text or the analysis after that. So yeah, just write in parts. When I was a grad student, I was in a writing group with humanities students. And this was actually kind of helpful because they talk a lot more about the discipline of writing. And so we would meet like every day for an hour and a half and just write in a coffee shop. And, I had no idea what they were writing about. They had no idea what I was writing about, but just that structure was really helpful. Yeah, they taught me this thing where like you can write for 2 hours, but then your productivity declines. So go do something that brings you joy for 30 minutes and then come back to it rather than sitting there all day.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, writing groups is something that definitely can be helpful. Flavia and Omar, would you have any suggestions for the writing process of a dissertation coming from the UK, Germany, or Italy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was something very similar to what Tripti said, actually. I should say first, though, that for me, at least, it was a little bit different because where I did my PhD in Padova, we had to publish papers. So that was the bulk of our PhD dissertation. So it was not required like a dissertation similar to what you do to graduate from a master or a bachelor degree, but it was a collection of papers. Anyway, when I started writing, I had the same problems where I started from. And for me, it was starting from the things that were feeling easier to write at that moment. So for instance, like Tripti said, the methods, I mean, if you got some data, obviously you went through a process and you should be able to describe that process in the method section. So you fill that section up and at least you get something broad, and that hopefully gives a little bit more confidence. So you kind of broke the ice at least. And then obviously you move to describing your results because obviously you will have results. So just describe what your results are. And then there will be the more difficult parts, so the discussion and the introduction, but at least in the meantime, you wrote something. And by writing this, you may have started a more like framed thinking on your data, on the process that you went through, and that also helped. So that would be my advice, basically.
And well, I did my PhD in the UK, where the writing up is a little bit different from other systems, including the European. The main difference is that feedback from the examiners does not come until you finish the thesis, and then you go into the corrections phase. So you deliver a raw thing that it's then going to be analyzed by your examiners. And then during the examination, which is the oral examination, that's when you realize all of the comments people have on your work. Before that is your supervisor who gives you comments on this. So just something to kind of wrap this up. The end, when does finish? Once you start, the difficult part is starting, but once you start, the difficult part is finishing. which is you will end up writing a lot and you will be like, it's not ready. Your thesis is never going to be ready because you're never done. You have found new questions, you have found new problems, you have found new things. And I was printing out my thesis the day I was supposed to hand in because I was very scared about getting things ready. And in the end, your examiners are focusing more on the science than on whether the tables are aligned. And they will pick up on these things, but it's, you know, it's not like their main thing. And writing is never going to be ready. So if the deadline is 15th of September, hand in on that day. Try not to get extensions unless you really need them. Like you couldn't write for a month because, I don't know, you were unemployed or you lost funding and things like that. So rather than just asking for extensions for, you know, I missed the deadline, often they are very expensive as well, and you have to justify them a lot. So that's a resource to leave for emergencies. Like that should be something you have in there in case there is a need for an extension. Like with COVID, I know of some cases where people were like, I want an extension, but they had already asked for two extensions. So the third, even though it was justified, the extension was not granted. So those extensions are for real situations. Not, I didn't finish my graph is not
Yes.
one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing your personal experiences and sharing a wide variety of writing experiences as well. Pretty sure that was pretty useful for everybody or a lot of people. I think we'll move on to the next topic of funding and getting grants. And I'll pose this question to Pedro. Do you want to get started on talking about schemes that are available for paleo PhD students, something that most benefited you? And because there are always those small pockets of money, and the thing is like, how do you find them and how do you apply?
Yeah, this is definitely a critical component of a PhD student, particularly if you're in the U.S. and Europe, where I'm more familiar with the funding sources and different schemes. Here in the U.S., there's quite a bit, like you mentioned, pockets of money, and often you find them in places you don't expect to find them. So, for instance, I'll just give a shout out for his Wyoming group that provides funding for anybody who wants to do field work in Wyoming with related to paleontology. I think it's called the Tobacco Roots Fund or something like that. And so on top, and also like for instance, the American Natural History Museum has funding for any sort of field work in paleo in North America. And then, but for me specifically, what I benefited from was student grants from the Paleo Society. And they have a wide breadth of different topics they're willing to consider. Anything basically under the umbrella of paleo, they're willing to fund. And so they're the ones that really help me out quite a bit. Depending on your institution could also have funding as well. I know my department had several funds intended for grad student research, and that also helped out quite a bit. There's also and besides the paleo world, there's other schemes as well. Like for instance, several geology societies also provide funding for anything that's paleo related. And on top of that, there's also some fraternities that give money as well. So for instance, in the U.S., Sigma Psi provides funding as well. So there's quite a bit of resources, and the list actually keeps growing. I feel like almost every year. And I think we here in one of my lab groups at Stanford, we have a running list of grants available to apply to. And I think last time I checked, it's well over 30. So there's quite a few. So definitely ask around your lab group, your PI, other grad students, because oftentimes you can spend a long time looking these up, but definitely ask around to people who've been around for a little bit, who are more senior. Don't know.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Pedro. Having like a list, that's really nice that you have like a list in your department for ongoing calls for funding and grants. I'll also pose the same question to Advait and Gabi. Do you have any suggestions for finding grants and funding that worked for you?
Yeah, I kind of just want to echo what Pedro was saying. You know, lots of these societies have small grants, and if you get a bunch of small grants, you get a lot of money after getting bunch of them. Nat Geo has excellent grants for paleontologists. If you're international, it gets a little more tricky, especially if there's citizenship-specific grants in the US. But again, most of these smaller grants through your department or through societies can be applied for irrespective of where you're from. But here, if you want to eventually, get a postdoc and go to an R1, applying for grants is really important. It might seem super tedious, but at the end of the day, it's well worth it. And even if you don't get it, it's good practice.
Yeah, and if you don't have any grants or your project isn't ready to be applying for grants on your own, I think asking your PI or some type of mentor if you can either help with them while they're writing their grants or look over it once they've submitted, anything along those lines will help you get more practice and a better understanding of like what a grant actually looks like, what should it include, what kind of like buzzwords do you use, what do you avoid saying. So yeah, take a look at what they've done too.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Flavia and Tripti, do you have any thoughts on grant writing? And also maybe a little bit about, I think as Advait was mentioning, get rejected quite a lot. And just the idea of like, just keep going and keep applying, and thoughts about that?
Yeah, just do it. Apply to anything that comes to your hand. I mean, in a sensible way. Doing my PhD, I applied to, I must say there was not as many opportunity in Italy, but anything that I could find, I applied, because as we said already, if nothing is just experience, it's just practice, is getting feedback from your mentor, from your supervisor or other mentors. So it's absolutely like a good experience. And if you get rejections, then try to learn from those rejections. Maybe ask if someone has been in your PhD school, for instance. I was thinking in Padua, we had this PhD school. Ask if someone who has been successful can give you their application, so then you can compare with there and see what they've been doing better compared to you, for instance. And if like in the happy case you are successful, that's a boost for your self-confidence and will help you to keep you going for a next application. So it's in my view, it's a win-win either case.
Yeah, my perspective is that it's also an opportunity to practice your writing that you can then paste into the manuscript version of whatever you're doing. I think it's great practice. I do think I would be wary if like you started a graduate program and someone told you that they would never pay you in the summer, so pay attention to, there's a certain level to which you should be guaranteed some security and funding, and then your grant writing is extra on top of that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then I think we'll move to the last topic, and also just sort of a heads up to the panelists that there are quite a few questions that have lined up in the Jamboard. So we'll do a 15 minutes, try and answer them. If there are anything that you really want to answer or a question stands out, so feel free to answer that when we get to the moderated question answers. But the last topic is post-PhD. What do you do after you get your PhD? So I'll open this question by posing it to Omar, and then the rest of the panelists can also chime in. So the question is, when should PhD students start thinking about careers post-PhD? Did you do any internships, placements during your PhD to think about long-term career plans, and if you wanted to go to a specific career?
Okay, well, I think probably the best time to start thinking about what to do next is when your funding is about to run out, as in, I don't know, your funding runs out 6 months before you actually finish the thesis. That's a good moment. Well, 6 months before that is a good moment to start thinking about it, because you will need the money. After I finished my PhD, I worked at a museum, and then I worked in the industry as a teacher. Something regarding the industry first is not, it doesn't look bad if you work in the industry as a teacher. mostly because teaching experience is a requirement for most of the entry-level requirements at university, and actually any teaching experience that you have will help a lot. In the US, that's probably not a problem. In Europe, it's a little bit because PhDs are done without teaching experience compulsorily. So you do need to get some teaching experience on that side. But also regarding probably the question of what's better, the industry, academia, what I would suggest is try both. If you get the chance to do an internship at the industry, you should give that a shot. In my case, I tried as a teacher. They are both equally toxic, as in which one is better. I feel like you have pros and cons in both. The toxic environment you may complain in academia, it's also present in the industry. It's not like the industry is this magic place where problems are not present. And if you join the industry in academia, most likely those, well, if you join the industry from the academic background, likely those jobs don't have unions. And if they don't have unions, you are going to be in a precarious position as well, just like you were in academia. So don't choose this in your best interest. Do you need the money? Do you want to start making money as fast as possible or as quick as possible? Do you want flexible hours? And this kind of things, you should start thinking about them before you run in a situation where you are unemployed and writing. So when to start thinking about this? When you know you're gonna need the money. And another probably thing to do is to approach your supervisor with the problem and ask them for suggestions. What do they recommend? Ask the university if there is like any help. In the case of UCL, for instance, they had a little hub and they help you find jobs inside the university, but they were pretty much outside in terms of the industry level, or they will find companies that were looking for interns and stuff like that. And it's good to do this when you're just writing, because there is no more collecting data, there is not more research trips, there is not more conference trips probably. So that's probably the best time to start thinking about that. You know, if you get bored of writing, you can think about the future.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Omar. Flavia and Tripti, do you have anything to add on the discussion that Omar just gave?
Well, I'm a very anxious person, so I started thinking about the next step very early, like third year PhD. And that actually ended up being helpful because it took a while for the mentor I wanted to do my postdoc with and I to find the money for the postdoc to happen. It's sort of an increasing problem in academia, right? Our institutions are underfunded, and so it becomes harder and harder to find a position next. And so if you're like me and have an anxious disposition or just don't like uncertainty, start as early as you have the bandwidth to.
Yeah, I would say ideally have a sense of whether you want to stay in academia or not, even before you start a PhD or at the very beginning, and then keep assessing that while you go on. Also, and the reason why I'm saying that is that depending on whether you want to be in academia in the future or not, you can give your PhD different directions. So you can tailor a little bit your PhD depending on whether you want to stay in academia or not. Because there are things, for instance, in my case, I always knew I wanted to stay in academia and that I was doing a PhD to stay in academia, regardless of whether we are going to be successful or not, personal goal. And these allowed me to do certain things, like, for instance, applying for fellowship for grants, because that looks good in your CV if you're applying for postdoc position, or writing papers. If you don't care about staying in academia, I mean, writing is good, it's important to write your thesis, but you can eventually not even publish a paper if you don't want to stay in academia. But if you do want to stay in academia, then you should try to at least get one one paper out of your PhD, I would say, because that's really important for postdoc applications. So depending on these things, you can yes, address your PhD in different ways, in different directions. So I would say the sooner you know that, the better. That's my advice. Hopefully it doesn't put pressure. That's my personal advice.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, Flavia. And to end this topic, I would also pose the same question to Pedro, Advait, and Gabi in terms of when did you start thinking about post-PhD, and did you do any internships or placements during your PhD?
Yeah, so I think I started to think about post-PhD a bit too late. I should have done what Tripti suggested and start thinking about it from day one. Basically, paleo is an esoteric field with very, very few jobs, especially in academia. Just to give you some numbers, NSF has some data which talks about, like, there are about 30 paleo PhDs produced every year. And for paleo-specific academic jobs, this year there are only about 5. So that should sort of give you a sense of the ratio between number of people that are getting PhDs in our field and the jobs available in the US in sort of tenure track academic positions. So keeping that in mind, think very long and hard about the kind of academic job that you might want. If you want to go and teach at a small teaching school, try and get as much teaching or mentorship experience as you can throughout your graduate career. If you want to go to an R1, pick up lots of skills that'll make you, sort of the next big thing. Apply for grants, try and publish as much as you can. That normally helps put you above most other people. Postdocs in our field are short. So I was at the Smithsonian for my first postdoc, and that was a 2-year postdoc. I'm at Yale for my second one, which is also a 2-year postdoc. And it's really hard to do any kind of meaningful research in a 2-year position because you're sort of there trying to do stuff, trying to publish papers from your PhD or from your first postdoc, and then it's already time to get back on the job market. So what I would advise everyone to do is just like think long and hard about what you want to do, strategize about staying in academia, and pick up skills that you can then transfer out. Stuff like, data science. Learn how to code in R if you can. It seems to be what everyone is doing in paleo these days. It's a hard market out there. I can say that from personal experience being on it right now. So I think that's all I have to add. Pick up new skills, strategize from day one.
Pedro and Gabi, would you like to add anything? I know Gabi dropped something in the chat as well, so thank you for dropping that.
Yeah, I'm going to also add, your institution might have professional development available for grad students. Certainly that was the case for me, where University of Georgia has a future faculty fellowship program, and I was a part of that. And I did that for my last year of my PhD, and I wish I would have done it earlier. And so I also waited a little bit too long to work on this. And I was fortunate enough to at least land a couple of interviews, faculty interviews, during my final year of my PhD, but it was still clear that I wasn't quite ready yet based on the interviews and feedback that I got. And so, and because of that, I didn't start thinking postdoc until I had already finished. As a matter of fact, I didn't start applying until the very end of my last term and into the summer, and I was just fortunate enough that I got one over the summer. But don't assume you're going to get that lucky. I was extremely lucky, and definitely start thinking about it with at least 2 years left. Start making those connections with potential postdoc advisors if you want to go into academia, and if not, if you want to go into industry, start picking up other skills that will help you make that transition.
I think there's a huge number of positions that could be beneficial to you or could be really fulfilling. And so I would also try not to think of it as like either I will succeed and stay in academia or I will leave and fail, because personally I found a position outside of doing my own research and I have been enjoying it a lot and don't feel like I left science. I'm still involved. I'm just involved in a different way. So think about what you really like doing. what aspects you don't like, and figure out a position that might help you hit those, like check the right boxes for you, as opposed to just like what you think you should do.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing that. So yeah, we started off with all of everybody's feedback and discussion on what to do, or suggestions for incoming PhD students. And we've ended the PhD journey in these 40 minutes by talking about post-PhD possibilities. So thank you all for the discussion on that. And we will be uploading this to YouTube as well, so people can asynchronously hear what everybody had to say and share their experiences. So thank you for that once again. We'll move on to the moderated question and answer. So I will strategically or ask questions how they came in. And again, if there is a question that you're burning to answer, please feel free to answer that. But the first question from topic 1 that I'm going to pose to the panelists, and anyone who has an answer is feel free to just unmute yourself and answer that. But this is something that we discussed before, is how do you find informal mentors during your PhD?
I've been thinking about this based on my experience. And the advice I feel like giving is find someone who's not much more senior than you, and or that is not much older than you. So make sure there's not a huge generational gap between you and this person. So you want someone you could like talk easily to, so someone you will also hang out for having a beer together, but at the same time that you find inspirational and kind of a role model, like someone you would aspire to be like career-wise. So like someone you say in 5-6 year times, I would love to be like her, I would love to be like him. And that's the way thinking about this, thinking how to answer this question, I thought about who I kind of elected somehow as my informal mentors, and they were person who like fill these boxes, basically tick these boxes. Someone I like to talk to, but I also find inspirational in terms of career.
I would say that I found mine joining student societies. So I joined in UCL, there was a Mexican student society, which had people from all of their career stages, and they were all Mexican. So that was cool. It was like the Mexican experience in different ways. I also joined the postgrad society, which was just with random postgrad students from everywhere. And yeah, like Flavia said, it helps a lot that this is people going through pretty much the same, probably a year later, probably a year after. And it's kind of nice that sometimes you say, I'm going to do this, and somebody's like, oh, if you're going to do that, you should do this 6 months ahead. No, don't plan it like that. And that helps a lot. Like you can save a lot of time by learning on others people's mistakes. And probably if the university has like events like socials, trying to join them. Even, well, many of the new ways to do socials in universities do include the fact that some people is socially anxious. So go to these events with the idea that you want to find someone you can ask questions later on, and put yourself into that mindset. I am particularly a person that is socially anxious, but I joined the societies just so that I would not feel alone, which is two completely different things.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that question. And I think this sort of tails into a question that came live from our audience that's currently attending, and I've dropped it in the Zoom chat as well. And this hits a lot of topics that we were just discussing in terms of, could panelists get into more specifics of how to find collaborators and network at conferences? Do you suggest cold emailing people that you're interested in working with, taking advantage of existing connections? Maybe the panelists who haven't answered yet, they can add on what Flavia and Omar were talking about with by answering this question.
Sure, I can go since I did bring it up earlier in one of my answers. I'm an extrovert, so I don't really have problems going up to people and bugging them at conferences. It's a quirk of my personality. I think cold emailing is fine. I get cold emails from students and I have no problems answering them. At conferences, what I would suggest is talk to your PI, tell them about who you might want to meet, and have them make the introductions for you. Or if there's a senior postdoc in your lab or a senior grad student who might know someone else, have them do the initial introductions. And once you have a network formed at a conference, it's a lot easier to go and meet more people.
I think once you meet one person, it becomes a lot easier to just expand that. So I've definitely had conferences where I know exactly one person and I say like, I don't know anyone except you. Is it okay if I go around with you while you talk to people? And can you introduce me to your friends? Because I don't know anyone else, and be like super upfront about it rather than being like, oh, it's nice to meet you. Like, who are you going to talk to? Like, I just try to make it really clear. And tag along, and it's okay to be like a little lost duckling for some of your conferences because soon you'll be having your own network.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think we can move on to another question that came through, and that talks about time management. And based on like the discussion that we just had, the question is, the person wants to know the breakdown between time spent teaching, doing research, taking classes, and how that changes over the course of grad school. And I know the answer might be a bit different from European versus US. So I think panelist members that would like to answer that, please feel free.
Yeah, I think as I was saying before, it really also depends, unless you have specific constraint, depending on your PhD school or your institution, your affiliation. It really depends where you want to go with your PhD. So as similar to what Advait said, if you want to go in a small college, say, then it's important to have a lot of teaching. If you want to move on to a postdoc and like a scientific research career, then it's important to focus more on research and publishing papers, making your CV very robust for academic positions. So it really depends where you want to go, unless there are specific constraints. Like I'm thinking here, Bergen, my department in Bergen, the PhD student needs to do a fixed amount of teaching, and then there is no way around it. Then you have to do it. If you have this type of constraint, then you have to do it. So that's the way it is. If you have freedom, you decide depending on your priorities.
I don't know what the breakdown was for me, but I do advise students to reserve a day, at least a full day a week, where you're only focusing on your own research, because it's really easy to get caught up in the stuff you have to do daily, like the daily deadlines of grading or whatever, and lose sight of research for extended periods of time. The other thing I would say to pay attention to, and we talk about this at the faculty level, but I also notice it happens amongst grad students, pay attention to who's doing the labor of keeping the grad student community going in grad school. Sometimes it can be pretty asymmetric between like minority and female or women identifying grad students. And so, yeah, just make sure you're carving out the time you need to keep your progress towards your degree going, even though all those other things are important to do.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm just going to add to that is that once you start moving on in your PhD, you might get asked to be on side projects and people will start asking more and more of you. It's okay to say no.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think another question that came through the audience was, and I'm going to drop that in the chat as well, and it sort of touches on the different topics you were just talking about, from mentorship and fieldwork. And this question is specifically, I'm curious to what extent folks' dissertations were related to their advisors' work, how much leeway there is, and if somebody wants to answer that or give thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I can chime in on that because that definitely influenced how I picked my project. And So when I came in, I was given complete freedom to pick a project that I wanted to work on, and just basically develop it. And but the one thing that I really wanted to do is I didn't want to just come in with something that I was going to do on my own, or that I was only going to contribute to myself. And so what I really was interested in doing is creating a project that fit into the overall project that my PI had with his other students. And so he had master's students, and with master's students, he better assigns them projects. And so I wanted to be able to tie into that, so that as a lab, we were all pretty much working on a similar topic, just doing different things. And so that was a huge influence for me, was I wanted to be able to make that work. But overall, it had very little bearing on the work that my advisor actually did. And so, and I think that was critical for me as well, because I wanted to be as independent as possible, but at the same time, be a part of a cohesive group. And so it's definitely a balance you want to figure out. And it also helps if coming in, you already have a rough idea of some projects you're interested in working on.
Yeah, so getting as much information as you need before you apply to graduate school. And that actually is another question that was posed by an audience member and ties in. How do you advise students? Oh, I guess the idea of the question is, how do you know when to apply for graduate school in the first place after undergraduate versus taking a break? So if you have any insights of, we were talking about post-PhD, but I think this question is pre-PhD. Do I take a break? Do I try and figure out what I want to do before, and then thoughts on that?
If I can chime in, there are pros and cons to both. I went straight through, and I think there's some momentum you can maintain by doing that. So I remember my first year when I was doing problem sets, I was like, this is fun, this is just homework. Whereas my roommate, who had been out for a while, was like, why do we have so much paperwork to do as part of this? At the same time, if you take a break and sort of take time to work, maybe in industry or something else, you might have better perspective on why you're in grad school. Or I've noticed your work ethic has a different sort of flavor to it. You're better at time management. So there are pros and cons. I don't think it's easy to advise one way or the other, because it really depends on you.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Tripti just said.
I want to chime in on the perspective of someone who took a time. So after I finished undergrad, I started working again as a teacher in Mexico. By that point, I have decided that if I wanted to carry on grad school, it would be outside of Mexico, not really in. And I think something that working helped a lot with is that I got an appreciation of what my time is. So when I got to the PhD, I was very effective and assertive with my supervisor to be like, these are my limits. And this is how much I am willing to work on something. And you are not afraid of putting this as a limit, because you know that that's something you can do because you were working in the industry where your time is actually valued in the terms of, you know, they pay you for a certain amount of hours and you're very aware of doing unpaid work. So it helps a lot to have this perspective of being not longer a student doing moving into grad school, but being an employee who has just accepted to work in research. So in that regard, I think taking a break helped a lot with valuing my time a little bit more. The disadvantage is that obviously that momentum is gone and it's very difficult to move back into the student mindset, but also you become more flexible of recovering the mindset of student. And I think that helped a lot later on. Now, if I want to start taking a course on anything, I remember how transition from not being a student to a student again, and I can do that again now. So that also has helped a lot.
Great, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And with that, I do definitely want to make sure everybody does like a virtual round of applause for, thank you for answering all the questions. There are a lot more that maybe we can find another time that you can answer them. But thank you again for taking out time and having this wonderful discussion on navigating grad school. And thank you everybody for joining us. Please fill out the weekly form, which should be dropped in the chat. Next month, actually, in the new year, we have Tyler Kukla from Stanford University who will be talking about terrestrial paleoclimatology. But we hope you have an awesome rest of December and looking forward to seeing you in 2020. We will be having a tea time with the panel. So if you want to ask any questions that weren't answered by the panelists or just an informal discussion on PhD experiences and to continue the conversation, please stick around. Those are very valuable. And then it's time for a break before we get into tea time. So I will start a 2-minute talk. You can close out your video, go take a drink of water, come back, and we'll see you in 2 minutes. And thank you all again for attending, and thank you, panelists.